Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of January of 2023. Today we have a lot of interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start our discussion with the battle for Soledar, because yesterday we started this discussion and today I believe that we need to continue. And as you can see, as you may see, the Ukrainians are not planning to give up and are not planning to step back from this territory. And this says a lot. It tells us a lot about the situation. First of all, it tells us that that the situation is not critical, because if you follow the Russian military channels or Russian military experts, you will see that most of them are saying that the situation in Soledar is critical. That situation in Soledar is almost done, that Ukrainians have been collapsed, that the front lines have been penetrated and so on, but it's not true. And today we will discuss why, and today I will try to explain to you that the battle for Soledar haven't even started yet, and I'm not saying that the Russians are not able to take Soledar. You need to understand the difference. The Russians will take Soledar, but now the question is not about taking Soledar or not taking Soledar. There is just one question or few questions, and when talking about the Ukrainians, we have one question from their side. How expensive the Ukrainians are able to sell this Soledar. I'm not talking sell like for real money, I'm talking about the casualties and losses from the Russian side and from their side as well. And there is only one question from the Russian side: how much the Russians are going to pay with the blood for this town. And I believe that the price for the Russians, I believe, are going to be very high. Of course, if the Ukrainians are smart and if Ukrainians were able to prepare Soledar, I believe they had a lot of time to do this. They have like 9 months of clashes for Soledar to prepare this territory. If they're smart, and I believe they are, so that means that they managed to prepare the defense system in this area, defense orders, and now the Russians need to crack this nut. Now let's talk about Soledar in more details. One more time, let's update the information we have right now. When talking about the Western sources map, we see that the Russians established control over the south and southeast part of Soledar, and they entered the Soledar from the south. It's industrial area. This is the railroad station industrial area, and the Russians call this area as a salt mines 1/3. So let's return back to the Russian sources map. As you can see, this is the salt mines, this industrial zone. This is like the facilities on the ground, and there are a lot of caves, salt caves underground, and there are some facilities above the ground. As you can see, the Russian sources map and the Western source map, when talking about this part of Soledar, shows almost the same picture, that the Russians get control over this residential area and they enter the east part of this industrial area. So when talking about, there's almost the same picture, but with some small differences. Another confirmation of situation in Soledar we might find on deployment map, because they updated this map today, and they shows almost the same picture as the Russian sources map shows. The deployment map shows that the Russians enter the south part of the salt mines, and the Russians enter the north part of residential area. There is a garages in this area, and there is a residential area. And as we discussed, this corner building, the Russia somehow, I don't know how the Russians managed to establish control over this corner building, and I believe that this is the most important part of Soledar that the Russians managed to take control over. I don't know how the Ukrainians missed that attack. It was a big failure. It was an epic fail from the Ukrainian side, because these small corner, these garages may turn the entire situation in Soledar, and the taking control over this corner increase the chances of the Russians to pass through Soledar very fast and with less losses than it planned to be. And now let's return back to the Russian source map. This shows almost the same situation, but this corner building is, according to the Russian sources map, is located in the gray zone, the same situation with these garages. So during the day I haven't received any updates or confirmation or not about this territory. I believe that the Russians control this part, I believe that Ukrainians these days try to understand, try to find a solution how to push the Russians back from this block, because this is the focal point. And if the Ukrainians are able to push the Russians back from this corner building, then they will be able to increase the time that they are able to control, to save control, to keep control over these Soledar fortifications. Now let's return back to the Western sources map and let's try to split, to analyze this Soledar and try to understand the weak and the powerful position from the Ukrainian side. First of all, as we discussed, the Ukrainians now tries to prepare to build their defense line according this railroad rockade, then along the river, and they're coming to this cross. So this is the first Ukrainian positions where they're trying to stop the Russians from the south. There is a railroad barrier, there is a river barrier, and many other barriers that the Ukrainians uses to slow down the Russians. Another important area is between this lake and this road. Let's return back to the Russian sources map. This is a forest, and I believe that this forest is completely full of trenches the Ukrainians have prepared, so I don't think that even the fly are able to cross this area. So let's update this small position Ukrainian in this side. When we're moving a little bit to the north to this area, and so this big I don't know, forest with the lines, when talking about the south part, this is a cemetery, and when talking about the north, it's some kind of residential area, but as you can see, there are no buildings at all in this area, just very small buildings. I'm not even sure what is this, but anyway, I don't think that Ukrainians have position there, because the Russians are able to use against this position, let's say, some flamethrower systems or some I don't know, MLS systems, and of course the Ukrainians will be reduced in these fields very fast. But I believe that Ukrainians have mined this territory heavily, so when talking about the Russians, I'm not sure that they are able to cross this territory very fast because of mines. And furthermore, there is another benefit from the Ukrainian side, and I'm talking about this street, this very wide street that moves along entire north part of Soledar, this one. So this is some kind of another barrier that the Russians need to cross if they decide to storm these residential areas. So let's update. And so I believe that the Ukrainians prepared their defense line along this street. It's like a natural, we can say, even barrier. It's a very wide street, and it's some kind of local rockade in this town. And anyway, the Russians during the previous months, during the storm process of Mariupol, during the storm process of any other town, they had a lot of problems with such wide streets. There are a lot of sniper positions in this town, in these buildings, in this residential area. So I don't know. I don't think that it's an easy job even to cross just a small street. And another defense position from the Ukrainian side is this north residential area, this one. I believe that Ukrainians were planning to use this residential area as the main defense position in entire Soledar. But as we discussed today and these days, somehow the Russians managed to penetrate and to develop their bridge from Yakovlivka in direction of these brushes and this forest line. And from this position, the Russians somehow very fast, with a very short jump, managed to enter the garages, this residential area, and to establish control over this corner building. And this operation was amazing, believe me. This is amazing operation because the Ukrainians missed that attack. I don't know how the Russians could do this, because they were always on the fire, but somehow they did this, and now the Ukrainians have a lot of problems. Now let's update this map according to situation. We understand what territory is under Russian control. When talking about the south, everything we understand that the Russians are here. Now they are somewhere on the east from the cemetery, then they're moving to this residential area. I believe that this area is completely mined, so we will go to the north, then to the west, and then back to the north to these brushes. I believe they control a lot these days. And now we are on the north of Yakovlivka, Bilogorovka, and we are around Berestova. So this is the bridgehead. According to information we have these days, is under Russian control. So what to do next, what the Russians are able to do next, and if they have any plan, and so on. And we will return back one more time to this residential area, to this block on the north. This is one of the most important part of Soledar, and somehow the Russians managed to get there. Now I believe that these days the Russians will try to complete the clearing operation of this area, and the thing is that they need to do this very fast. They need to do this very fast before the Ukrainians haven't awakened from the situation they appeared in, and if the success of further offensive operation of storming operation of Soledar depends on how fast the Russians are able to establish control over this north block, and I believe that the Russians are not going to count their losses, they're not going to count their resources, but they need to take this. What this block gives to the Russians? First of all, if the Russians are able to establish control over this block, let's return to the Western sources map, this is the block I'm talking about, then they will be able to start they will be able to push the Ukrainians back, and they will be able to save their flanks of their infantry and small storm groups using the local roads to attack hospital. This is hospital from the north, and this residential area. So this is two very important areas that the Russians will try to focus on as soon as they get control over the north part of Soledar. So let's update this. So the Russians, using these local roads, maybe they will be able to use even tanks and armored vehicles. They will try to attack these two blocks, the small street on the west from these garages and the hospital, and the Russians will try to take control and to establish their position there. If the Russians are able to do this, we understand and we see from this situation that they will be able to encircle entire Soledar just by taking these two blocks. Now let's discuss, and after that we can start counting days before Soledar is going to fall, because the main cross will be under Russian control. The Ukrainians won't be able to use the roads to supply the residential area of Soledar through the south, through this railroad station, for many reasons. One of them is there are a lot of barriers to supply and support. The railroad barrier, the water barrier, and when talking about infantry, yes, the Ukrainians will be able to move infantry and to supply this area with the infantry, but I'm not sure that the Ukrainians will be able to supply and support Soledar with very nice support, just using like infantry. They need road, they need cars, trucks, they need armored vehicles, and from this moment, as soon as the Russians establish control over this cross, the Ukrainians will lose these possibilities. Now let's talk about the forces, about the armies that Ukrainians uses to protect Soledar. For these purposes, let's return back to deployment map. And when talking about the Ukrainians' defense, we see that they moved their 128th brigade, this one, Mountain Assault Brigade. The Russians are saying that this brigade, after heavy losses, decided to stop following the orders, and they decided to leave their position. And some Russian sources are saying that that was exactly the reason why the Russians were so successful in Soledar, because the fact that this brigade just decided to run away, to escape, to evacuate, to fall back from their position without waiting or expecting for reinforcement. The Ukrainian commanders sent 46 Air Mobile Brigade to replace this 128th Brigade, but as we can see, they did this a little bit late, and because of that they lost a lot. We understand, we can compare like these two brigades, 128th and this 46. The Ukrainians just wanted to save 46th Brigade, and they just wanted to save more professional brigade, and that's why they decided to hold as long as possible on their position 128. But they forget about one thing, that it's not just the icons on the map, it's the real people. And no matter you belong to 128 or you belong to 46 Air Mobile Brigade, nobody wants to die, and these people make their right decision. They decided to fall back because of the fact that the Ukrainian commanders dropped them. Like they decided to, I don't know, to reduce this brigade in favor of this 46th brigade. So, but by the 8th of January, we can say that somehow the Ukrainians managed to complete this rotation process and deploy 46th Mobile Brigade, completely prepared, fully blooded. This brigade is ready to fight, to give a battle for the Russians. And this brigade is ready to start a counter-offensive operation in the north part of Soledar to stop the Russians' movement on the south. And there is another problem for the Russians, and now I'm talking about the base of this defense structure, and I'm talking about these two tanks brigade. As you can see, the Ukrainians move just infantry inside of town. I believe that there are some armored vehicles, heavy armored vehicles, to supply and support the Ukrainian Soledar, but the main base of this defense stands a little bit to the west from Soledar, and I'm talking about 17th Tank Brigade that located on the north, and 4th Tank Brigade is located on the south. The Ukrainians deployed these two tank brigades on the base of Soledar defense for one reason, because the Ukrainians understand that the Russians, if they want to encircle Soledar and to solve the problem, they need to move exactly as we discussed, through this residential area in direction of this hospital and in direction of this street. So that's why the Ukrainians deployed their 17th Tank Brigade on the north with one purpose: to pin down the Russians, to attack them using tanks where their movement, not to allow them to supply and support their offensive operation on the north of Soledar. So this is the reason. And the same thing on the south, the Ukrainians need to keep Krasnogora, and for these purposes they deploy their 4th Tanks Brigade, and this is the same situation. This is the base of their defense of Soledar with one purpose: to pin down the Russians and not to allow them to get in direction of Blagodatne. So if there were no brigade on the south of Soledar and Krasnogora, the Russians' main goal would be from this direction, after taking Krasnogora, to get control over Blagodatne, somehow with the infantry, to establish fire or physical control on or something like this, and it will be the same encirclement of Soledar. But the Ukrainians, they understand this. Everybody, I believe, understand this. So that's why they have 2 tanks brigade on the base of Ukrainian defense in Soledar. And as you can see, the structure is very interesting, and it's not an easy job to crack this net. It's not an easy, it will take time. If the Ukrainians are smart, and if the Ukrainians are able to do everything smart, the Russians will be forced to pay a lot of time, a lot of resources before taking this town. But the Russians anyway are going to take this town. It's just a question of time and the price that they will pay for this. When talking about the south area, Bakhmut, as we discussed yesterday, today we received another confirmation that the Russians established control over Podgorodnya, and the Russians, as a part of Soledar storm operation, the Russians these days will activate their actions in direction of Krasnogora with one purpose: to freeze and pin down the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian 24th Mechanized Brigade, as you can see, this brigade were deployed in this area in the early December, so I'm not even sure that this brigade is able to continue their trip in the Soledar. So I believe that this is the reason why the Ukrainians deployed 63rd Mechanized Brigade in this area. It's some kind of replacement of these 24th, and maybe this was the reason why the Ukrainians lost the battle for Podgorodny, maybe the same rotation process. Anyway, the situation with Ukrainian reserves are very difficult, and I can't even understand what the Ukrainians are planning to do. Furthermore, don't forget that now, as soon as the Russians develop their bridgehead on the north of Soledar, now they can, and I believe that these days we're going to see offensive operation in direction of Razdolovka. Because maybe if the Russians are not able to achieve success on the north of Soledar, maybe they will be able to develop success in Razdolovka, because every single square meters in this area can change and turn the entire situation in Soledar. The Russians will increase the pressure, and these days is the most important. But maybe all the things I explained to you is just some kind of speculation, because maybe the Ukrainians in Soledar really have been collapsed by the Russians, and now they're just running away in panic. Anything might happen. Anything might happen. Of course, it's the worst scenario for the Ukrainians and the best scenario for the Russians, because they will be able not to stop and continue their movements along MO3 road and to encircle Bakhmut from the north and many other things. But something tells me that at least a week or maybe 2 weeks of heavy clashes we're going to see inside of Soledar. So let's see, let's follow this situation as well. Now let's return to the ground and let's discuss the situation that took place on the front lines. When talking about Kupiansk front line, the situation is the same. The Ukrainians tried to send their commandos and scouts to discover the Russian positions. They tried to accumulate forces, but they have completely dropped an idea about starting any offensive operation in direction of Svatova. They are not ready for this. They don't have reserves. They don't have resources for this. They are completely concentrated on the defense of Soledar and Bakhmut, and the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 30 soldiers and something around 4 armored vehicles and 2 commandos group on Kupiansk front line. The same situation is on Liman. The Ukrainians managed to develop significant success near Kramatorsk, and they were ready to start offensive operation in just maybe days or maybe minutes was between the Ukrainians and starting offensive operation direction Kramatorsk, but all their plans were ruined by successful and significant success of the Russians in Yakovlevka and Soledar. Now the Ukrainians can't just start anything because they understand if the Russians are able to penetrate Soledar, they will be able then to encircle Seversk, and Seversk is the base of Ukrainian offensive operation to Kramatorsk. So until the Ukrainians understand that Seversk is the safe side, until they understand that situation that their flanks is protected, they won't start any offensive operation direction of Kramatorsk. And so, but as I understand, the story about Soledar is already done. Now the Ukrainians, I believe, need to start, I don't know, stepping back from these fields. There are no barriers, there are no place to hide. So anyway, when talking about the Ukrainians to step back from these fields on the west side of Oskol River is also an option for the Ukrainians just to save manpower. By stepping back on the west side of Oskol River, the Ukrainians will be able to do the same as the Russians did in Kherson district when they moved a lot of forces on the east side of Dnipro, and with this, like Dnipro is a wide river, it's like a real natural barrier that the Ukrainians are not able to cross, and they managed to release a lot of forces that were sent to Donetsk, South Donetsk area, and so on. So if Ukrainians want to stop the Russians in Bakhmut and Soledar, I believe that they need to move their forces back on the west side of Oskol River. This Oskol River, let's return back to the Western Sources map. This is the river. As you can see, it's a pretty wide river, and after that the Ukrainians will be able to move their forces. Let's take a look at deployment map. As you can see, there are a lot of forces that Ukrainians are able to use in Bakhmut. Maybe this can solve their problems, but the Ukrainians are not doing this. They still hope and they still think that sooner or later they will start offensive operation Kupiansk, Kramatorsk, maybe with help of upcoming Western supply and support. I don't believe in this, but they believe, so maybe they know something that we don't know. When talking about Liman frontline, the loss of Ukrainians around 50 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and other 2 commandos were destroyed in these forests and so on. When talking about Bakhmut, we discussed Soledar. There are some movements inside Klishevka. The Russians reported maybe 3rd or 4th time in a row that they managed to develop another square meters inside of Klishevka, that they got as close as possible to this fortification, to these trenches, but no more progress in this area. I believe that the Russians, at least for now, they don't need the progress in this area. I believe that now they're completely concentrated in Soledar, and after Soledar story, they may continue the offensive operation in Klishevka. When talking about Donetsk, there are no updates, no changes in this area. Donetsk is under fire, and the Ukrainians, as you can see, also reduced the artillery duels in this area. There was some updates that Ukrainians lost some artillery systems in Karlovka, but nothing more from this area. And when talking about South Donetsk and Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost around 110 soldiers and something around 7 armored vehicles along the front line, but without any changes on the ground, without any movements on the ground, and so on. Another important update are coming from Kramatorsk. This is Kramatorsk, and as you can see, there are no icon in this area, but today the Russian Ministry of Defense, during the report, they said that as a revenge for the Ukrainian attack against Makiivka, I'll remind you one more time that On New Year Eve, the Ukrainians attack a small town by the name of Makiivka. This one, they attack a building inside of this town where the Russians deployed their forces during the New York during the New Year Eve, and some sources are saying that the Russians lost more than 100 soldiers as a result of that attack. So today the Russians reported about some kind of steps of their revenge, and they told us that they spotted in Kramatorsk at least 2 buildings where the Ukrainians deployed up to 1,300 soldiers. They deployed 600 soldiers in one building and 700 in another building. And during these days, the Russians attacked this area, and today they reported that as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost around 600 soldiers in this that were buried under the ruins of those ruined buildings or something like this. So as we can see, the front lines have been activated heavily. The Ukrainians don't want to start any negotiation process. The Russians attacks all over the front line. A very interesting situation in south of Bakhmut and Soledar. I believe that both those towns will fall sooner or later. And what is going to be next is very difficult to understand and very difficult to project, because if the Russians are able to take Bakhmut and Soledar, a lot of territories, a lot of places to maneuver will be open for them. It's like an operational square. Seversk will be automatically encircled and so on. So this is a very vital question for the Ukrainians to keep this area, and not just about the ground, also about supply and support from the West countries. I'll remind you that the Western countries asked Zelensky not to have a very big losses during this day. They're not saying about losses. I believe that they understand that now the Ukrainians are not ready to stop the Russians before new supply and support arrives. But the only job for Zelensky is not to allow like a big collapse on the front line. And if he's able to keep his army during the winter campaign, then we're going to see the spring campaign, and where the Ukrainians will receive NATO modern weapon, armored vehicles, and it's going to be a completely different story. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you can condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your like, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.